Thanks. And I want to send out a big thanks to the Institute of Urban Research who's having me here. I want to, if you'll forgive me, begin with reading a little bit of the preface from my forthcoming book, which is going to be on Northern Europe, geopolitics, and Nordic noir. And I think you'll see the sort of connection to what Bo was talking about with my past research and my present research, and then hopefully from there we can carry on. So that book that I'm talking about actually began on the bridge. In December of 2015, I attended a Carlsberg-funded workshop at the University of Copenhagen on what was called Typical Russian Autocracy versus Shockingly Depraved Europe, a conference on cultural stereotypes and popular geopolitics in the Putin age. The organizer of said conference is actually here in the room this evening, but I don't want to point her out. There she is. Say hello, Tina. And during a break between sessions, my frequent collaborator and fellow Florida man, and I'll come back to the topic of Florida in a second, Jason Dittmer pulled me aside and asked me if I'd seen the Swedish-Danish television series, The Bridge. I confessed ignorance of its very existence, but I did a bit of research that evening, and before the sun set on the next day, which, as you all know, this time of year, so it's about 3:30 p.m., I'd already decided to use my remaining time overseas to cross the Øresund Strait and visit Malmö. Luckily, a Danish colleague urged me to grab my passport before heading over the bridge to Skåne, while dutifully reminding me of the fact that where I was heading used to belong to Denmark. Again, my ignorance prompted further discussion. I had wrongly assumed Schengen protocols were in effect, thus allowing unfettered movement between Denmark and Scandinavia. But this was not the case, nor is it at this very date. My interlocutor seemed to resent the new border controls to no end, given both Denmark's historic loss of a big chunk of the southern part of the Scandinavian peninsula and the current interruption in the social and economic flows that had been taken for granted since the bridge opened on the 1st of July in 2000. He informed me that, due to the so-called Syrian refugee crisis, Sweden has imposed identity checks on certain routes from Denmark, including train and road travel via the Øresund Bridge, that eponymous liminal space so associated now with the world's most popular Nordic noir television series. Indeed, a perfunctory check of my U.S. passport occurred during the passage from Copenhagen Central Station to Malmö City. Being a middle-aged American male mantled in a north-faced winter coat, sporting a topknot and an overgrown and salt and pepper beard, and features that often promote comments that I, quote, look like a Viking, I breezed through with hardly a second glance at my identity papers. Thereafter, I spent a wonderful day exploring Sweden's southern capital, gazing at its architecture and street art, probing its beer culture, and sampling its cuisine. That fleeting day was capped off by an impromptu visit to the Gothic St. Petri's Church, where I sat in awe, listening to the choir practice for their Christmas performance in one of the best sound caves I had ever entered. This southern Scandinavian city, as Sibling, Johansson, and Sayer, who wrote the lookbook that ultimately would give birth to the series The Bridge, which was made into an anonymous urbanscape for 4 seasons of that show, and regularly vilified on Fox News through the medium of the town of Rosengård as a space where, quote-unquote, Europe died. But this place captured my heart and my imagination. Filled with color, life, and a friendly, multicultural populace, it defied all stereotypes that I had been exposed to, including those by my own Swedish friends from Stockholm who chided me that Malmö isn't even part of Sweden. In the coming weeks, I began a new research agenda that dragged me west but kept me moored in an academically safe space. As Bill referred to, my previous scholarship was mostly focused on Russia, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe, and more specifically Western and Anglophone representations of these post-socialist spaces. Of course, at the time, I did not know how important that bridge crossing would be. But after 2 years of sustained scholarly inquiry and repeated visits to Denmark and Sweden, as well as forays to Iceland, Norway, and finally to Finland, it started to become clear to me that the bridge and the bridge had changed my life forever, both academically and personally. Crossing that chasm certainly had costs, but the benefits that came with it have produced the book that will soon be published by Routledge. Since those heady days that fired my northern imagination, my Netflix profile has siloed, shrinking in some ways while expanding in others. My choices slowly taught the great algorithms that Netflix relies on to make it one of the most successful companies in the new millennium that I wanted to live in a televisual world built around women detectives in chunky knitwear, darkened landscapes that pivoted from the urban to the boreal on a moment's notice, and socio-political realms defined by a cracked but not yet broken welfare state. The bridge led me down the new Nordic noir rabbit hole, and like Alice, I began to see the universe in a whole new way. So, with that said, I will, as promised, connect you back to my Florida man status. Some of you may be familiar with the film The Truman Show. In it, a man lives his whole life inside the set of a television series, not knowing that it is actually a performance for the outside world. And at one point, the producer, who is really the God character, Christoph, says, "We accept the reality of the world with which we are presented." It is simple as that, played by Ed Harris. This town, Seaside, Florida, is a town that I worked in for 3 months, the summer of my 16th year. So I myself have been in one of those spaces which was basically transmitted around the globe as a sort of representational space of a particular form of reality. So in that way, I find this connection to what I'm doing tonight and talking about the transmission of the image of Malmö as this fictitious southern Scandinavian city. I find a connection there going back to my earlier days. I want to begin with this quote. People from all cultures understand their experience and identities by engaging the stories of others and by constructing their own stories. But in today's culture, dominated by new media, experiences are becoming increasingly ambiguous and fragmented. Correspondingly, the stories that attempt to represent those experiences have become opaque and complex. These complex stories overturn folk psychological ways of understanding and instead represent radically new experiences and identities, which are usually coded as disturbing and traumatic. Now, the bridge wasn't the subject of this analysis, but I certainly think that this quote fits very well for the series. The type of research that I do focuses on popular culture and how geopolitical codes are basically established, maintained, and run through different forms of media, from big budget films to video games to comic books, even to jokes. But the thing that I've been focused on mostly over the past few years is what I call geopolitical television. This emergence of a new, very focused form of television programming that requires a great deal of attention. It requires you to watch and basically engage with the topics that are being discussed. It is long form in nature. It is not episodic. And it often deals with extremely serious matters, often matters of life and death. Daniel Dresner, who is an academic as well as a public intellectual, has commented that we live in a golden age of international relations programming on television. The proliferation of so many platforms has meant that there are now great shows that tackle eternal dilemmas of world politics in metaphorical worlds, past metaphorical worlds, and the world that we live in right now. And of course, he's mostly talking about Game of Thrones, the show that really has started to impact the ways in which many people engage with power politics. But there are other shows like The Bridge and some of the ones that I've been working on, especially in the realm of Nordic noir, that I think really fit Dresner's view of that. I briefly want to talk about how television is changing. He makes this reference to platform evolution. We can think of television in three versions, the original being what is often called television 1.0, which was national in form and distribution, done over the air. It was often viewed in the living room in a communal space, often multi-generational in that consumption. The programs which came on television were typically one and done, meaning they aired, and if you weren't there to see them, they were gone. And they were often discussed at what we would say in the United States, discussed at the water cooler the next day, perhaps at work, or in a discussion with friends, you might talk about those shows. In the 1990s, we moved to the era of television 2.0, increasingly less national in form and distribution. Satellite and cable television had allowed for the proliferation of series across national borders. They're often viewed in the room of one's choice, that is because there were new recording technologies which allowed you to basically record the show on a VHS tape, or increasingly DVR and other forms of programming which would allow for that delay. But we also had the notion of appointment TV, so there's lots of focus on showing up to watch a show at a particular time so you didn't miss anything, right? You could continue to talk about it the next day with friends. But we also had the introduction of the internet in a sort of more primitive form at that point, where people would go online and try and fill in gaps in particular series. Today, we're seeing a third iteration of television. It is increasingly global in distribution and form. It's mostly online and digital. It is viewed when and where one desires. Streaming, binging, downloading, etc. You can be watching in your office, you can be watching on a beach. Right? It is often discussed via social media and intermediate forums. And we are also seeing the advent of augmented reality. So certain networks such as Amazon Prime will actually allow you to pause, and you get more information about the television series that you're watching. So these are new forms of viewing that is allowing for new types of content to really begin to proliferate. So the type of work that I do, that geopolitical television that I focus on, engages with international themes via imaginary scenarios. Right? The Bridge is a great example of that. Particularly, it builds worlds based on situated social, geographic, and political understandings. And it interrogates questions of the domestic versus foreign when it comes to identity. And it uses those complex narratives from that first quote that I gave you. Some of the research that I've done, some of the series that I've focused on in the past, besides The Bridge, include the Danish parliamentary drama Borgen, the spy drama Berlin Station, which was on the US network Epix, the historical television series Deutschland 83, and there's been subsequently a Deutschland 86, which moved 3 years forward, and a series that some of you might be familiar with and was one of the most popular series from the region and in the United States for Netflix, and that is Occupied, which focuses on a near future where the Russian Federation invades Norway over a dispute over energy. What I want to talk about tonight, though, is a little bit less sort of grand in its geopolitical imaginings. I want to focus on the city in particular. Charlotte Brunson has recently published a book called Television Cities, where she focuses on 3 eras of television as well as 3 specific spaces in which television series were produced. And she looks at the detective genre as the one that is most important, because the detective genre really makes place and space. It brings it to the fore. You can't have a good detective yarn without really understanding where a particular crime was committed, what the social and economic factors surrounding the crime were, and then ultimately the resolution of the investigation hinges on place, space, and particularly timing. Those of you that know the Bridge very well know that the ØRESUNDSBROEN as a space is often a hindrance in the ability to solve a crime or to interrupt the crime from happening. So in her book, Brunson reflects on how television has emerged as a key site for imagining the city. The detective's role is extremely important for solving that mystery, and it also allows for the exploration of those dark places within those urban areas. But it is also about making and remaking of the nationhood through the locality. And she focuses in her last case study on a city in the United States, and that is Baltimore. We see here a quote from The Telegraph about The Wire, one of those shows in my writing that I think, alongside Lost and some of these other shows from the early 2000s, were really instrumental in creating this new long-form type of very, very demanding dramas with complex narratives. And the Telegraph talks about the series that the central character isn't a cop or criminal, but it's really the city itself, that fated industrial port of Baltimore, Maryland. And Baltimore doesn't seem like the most global of American cities, but if you watch the series, you'll see how all of these factors that are exogenous to the city, that are coming from overseas or other parts of the country, how they influence the crimes that are committed. there. The research that I've done on Malmo, the first research that I did was published in the Journal of Urban Cultural Studies, focusing on, and I'll talk a little bit about this as we move through the presentation, focusing specifically on the museum exhibit that was here in Malmo at the Technical Museum that was meant to coincide with season 3 of The Bridge. Maybe some of you had the opportunity to view that. So I look at seasons 1 through 3 of The Bridge. I also analyze The Bridge, A Dark Story, Visual Principles and Ideas. So this was the lookbook that was basically used to bring around to studios and producers to get the series greenlighted. It basically talks about what type of series it's going to be, what it's going to focus on, and also what the color palette, the lighting schemes are, the music, the mood, and how basically all of this will come together to present a sort of experience-scape of this imaginary southern Scandinavian city. And so I also look at the notion of tourism and how tourism after the bridge started to become popular, particularly in the UK, began to bring people here to Malmo to see the sites where Saga and Martin go to, and then later on different characters in the series. So I want to focus on Malmo as a real place, right? So if you noticed in the first slide, the opening slide that I gave you, I had manipulated the color palette a little bit of this exact photo to give it that kind of Nordic noir feeling. We see here the turning torso, which has become an iconic emblem of the city, replacing the Kockums crane, which was kind of a symbol of an older Malmo, an industrial Malmo. And now we have this Malmo being this sort of cultural capital of Sweden, the southern capital of Sweden in terms of new forms of art, food, all of these things coming together with this iconic building being a key representation of that new development and the new era for the city. I was talking about my experiences when I first came here, and then I returned in the next year during the late summer, and I encountered this as sort of my color palette for the city. This is what, in my mind, Malmo looks like. Not what you see when you're watching the bridge, when you're seeing all this darkness, various forms of black, white, and gray during the daytime, and then in the evening it's basically sepia mixed with shadow. So this, to me, this is my Malmo. And increasingly, this area has become my Malmo now that I'm based, at least temporarily, at Malmo University. So this is the area that I walk in. We have a kind of view of Malmhattan in the background there. This representation of Malmo as a super big city in a kind of small Scandinavian form. And also connected to the Technical Museum, we have this part of town as well, which kind of provides us with an entree into the Malmo of the past, a city that really came into being with the herring trade, so the connection to the sea, the connection to the greater world. Malmo, through its history, has always been a sort of outward-facing space as opposed to an inward-facing space. And part of that comes from the connection that is provided by the ocean, right? The ocean as a road, right, or some sort of passageway as opposed to a barrier. And coming from a long line of fishermen, I always looked at the ocean as a place that would take me to other places, not a place that would keep me on shore. And I think in many ways, sort of the esprit of Malmo conveys that. Right? So now, the show, the program. Malmo as a setting for the bridge. Right? I'm sure most of you wouldn't have come here tonight if you weren't familiar with the series, and it probably inconvenienced a lot of you over time. This is one of the sort of constant refrains that I've heard from citizens of the city that, oh, I can't go here, or this road is blocked off, or I just saw that yellow Porsche, so I know I need to avoid this part of town. All that's come to an end, though, of course. But the series itself is, to me, a sort of classic geographic, geopolitical thriller. It was not particularly successful in the region, right, in Denmark and Sweden, though it did fairly well, but it has been extremely successful outside of the country. It is available for viewing, in Netflix says, in over 170 countries. Initially it was on Hulu, so it's been picked up by a large number of these transnational digital distribution providers of television. It's also been adapted several times. So it was adapted in an American American-Mexico context by FX. Then later, a British and French collaboration created the tunnel. And then there's been an Estonian Russian version, Most, and then most recently, a Singaporean Malaysian version that ran on the network View. There is the promise eventually of a North Korean, South Korean version, I think, which will bring geopolitics really, really into the frame, even more so than has been done in those previous issues. There have also been cases where geopolitics intervened and kept a series from being produced. There were plans for a Ukrainian-Russian version, but after 2014, that was seen as not really, basically seen as a non-starter. So as I've said before, there's a southern Scandinavian city is represented, and for those of you who've watched it, I've heard from many people in my discussions over the years that there's a purposeful blurring of the lines between Copenhagen and Malmö, a kind of mixing of the two together to discombobulate the viewer. And this was by design. When I was viewing the lookbook, the story Bible that was created before the show went into production, this was the goal, to create this space that was neither Copenhagen nor Malmö, but a kind of mixture of the two. About 60% of the filming, to my reading, was done here in Sweden, some down in Ystad, and then the exterior scenes mostly done here in Malmö. And it presents this elsewhere, which is defined by shadow. It's a carefully constructed, well-thought-out world which is falling apart. So the theme of cracks runs literally through the creation of the show and through the various series. And these cracks are meant to show the pressures that are put on the Scandinavian welfare state in an era of globalization, neoliberalism, and other challenges, including issues of migration, which is one of the things that is explored in the first series when the so-called truth terrorist basically unveils these 5 truths to society: inequality, immigration, mental illness, homelessness, and child labor. And it's interesting, I've also done some work on the adaptations, the first 2 adaptations of The Bridge in the US-Mexico context and in the British-French context, and how these things actually can travel across borders. So this narrative is a very powerful one. It is also a very portable one. So Malmö is really making a difference around the globe. Looking at Nordic noir as a genre, it's really characterized by the use of Gothic narrative tropes of negative aesthetics and liminality. And that's why The Bridge is so important here, I think, as a binding element for the series, and perhaps why it was so successful, because really, what is more liminal than a bridge? What connects these two spaces? And it's used very effectively, I think, in the first season, in the first episode, and certainly in the climax of the last episode of the first season, to also be a metaphor for the liminality between life and death. Right. Nordic noir as a genre really is, or style, focuses on the region, Nordic Europe and Scandinavia in particular, the mood, gloomy cities, bleak landscapes, morose detectives, and importantly, and here we differ a good deal from similar types of detective work that's done in British series or American series or elsewhere, there really is a strong critical orientation. Social and political commentary is weaved into pretty much every aspect of criminality and the investigation process. And this is attributable to the sort of foundations of Nordic noir in the earlier literary genre, coming especially from Swedish writers from the late 1960s and early 1970s who approached the subject matter really with a left-wing critical orientation, looking at the crumbling of the people's home as a project under the stresses of the day. And so The Bridge really makes use of all of these and embodies all of these aspects of Nordic noir. Now the border here, and as I started the paper out, crossing the border is a daily reality. I've made a couple of crossings since arriving here a couple of weeks ago. In one case, my passport wasn't checked. In another case, the passport was checked. And so it's becoming this kind of, who knows what's going to happen when you come across the bridge. There's a little bit of ambiguity there. But then this quote shows how we actually conceive of the border. We don't need to be living next to it, even though being sat where we are today, we are quite close to an international border. But we see it in our mind's eye. It is a spectacle. right? And often being far from those physical boundaries, we still have a geographical imagination about what happens over there that helps us understand our place in the given nation that we live in, right? You see here a screenshot that I've taken about the centrality of the bridge in the first season as you're getting to the end point where they're starting to figure out who the truth terrorist actually is, who this person who's been committing all these crimes are. And you see here, basically he's created this perfectly sculpted room with all of this information, but the bridge is at the center of it, right? So, as I kind of alluded to before, ØRESUNDSBROEN as a barrier and also a binding agent for the region. And metaphorically, bridges really represent these links between spaces, right? They are elements of complex geographical configurations involving extended networks of actors. They're both local and nodes of wider regional, national, and sometimes even continental webs of interaction. The bridge is a sign standing for the metaphysical connection between nature and culture. It is also a sign standing for the connection between man and fate. And I think this is an excellent quote to put in context vis-a-vis the series. And we should also remember that a bridge is not simply a line between 2 points, but a machine that produces asymmetry, torsion, and tension, as well as contact and community. So bridges can be controversial spaces as well. So, how does the series show Malmö? We saw a little bit of the title credits there, the opening credits of the show. And you can see, as I mentioned before, the sort of sepia color palette with the belching there of gray smoke in the evening. This is a sort of iconic image for the series, right? We see here construction sites, this sort of a place in transition, but again with lots of gray, black, and kind of brownish colors, and low-hanging clouds. We see here part of the new development of Malmö, but again depicted in a way that is very sort of inhibiting, a place that you wouldn't necessarily want to be, even though I'm pretty sure the real estate prices of this neighborhood are quite high, being in the shadow of the turning torso. And the representation of Malmö in particular as a war zone. Right? We see here the graffiti, tents, a tent city, furniture thrown out, and the police, this sort of a constantly existing police presence everywhere. These are some of the ways that the series represents this mythical and mysterious place that is the home of the bridge. Right? And so when I'm thinking about geopolitical culture, and particularly when a series like this that's made in Scandinavia begins to travel around the globe, how do people view what's going on here? What sort of takeaways do they have? How do they process it through their political culture and through their lived experiences? Basically, how do they build or enhance the worlds that they've already built with this new information, and particularly this visual information that they have? And so we have here a quote from Musgrave and Daniel talking about what they refer to as these synthetic experiences, which are produced by narratives or fragments of a story, descriptions of a place, impressions of a culture. These dramatized portrayals of quote-unquote real processes and even real places. And it really, in these ways, it creates sort of pathways of thought, right? And it matters. So this is the argument that I make, that it matters when you go to the ballot box, when you meet someone from another country, when you have to start to think about issues like immigration or integration over time. So these fictional sources are, in many ways, influencing world politics. They're basically not dealing with factual content, but often what they portray becomes more real in the mind's eye than what is going on in the real world. So shifting gears a little bit, the notion of tourism. Come to see the bridge, right? Come to Malmö and see the place where the bridge takes place. Why is this sort of screen tourism important today? Well, city branding is all the rave. I mean, we've moved all the way up to the level of nation branding, with countries trying to redefine or enhance or establish their images around the globe to attract incoming investment, to bring in tourists, even in such cases, even at the highest level, really, to change their whole geopolitical profile. A country like Estonia did an enormous amount of work, invested tens and tens of millions of dollars into branding itself as a country that would be a great new member of the European Union as well as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So these are things that are really going on, but at the city level, it's easier to prove that your campaigns are effective. And increasingly, we're seeing television series actually starting to eclipse film as one of the most important inputs in why people want to visit particular places that they've interacted with in popular culture. And I'm just giving you sort of three examples here. Breaking Bad, the city of Albuquerque in New Mexico, certainly the historical drama Babylon Berlin, which depicts the city during the interwar period. And of course, Game of Thrones tourism is probably sort of the leading factor in this type of research that's being done now. I had the opportunity to revisit Dubrovnik this past summer, where now the locals refer to the tourists who get off the cruise ships or fly in to see the city, which basically is the main capital in the series, and they refer to these tourists as white walkers, right? Basically, zombies wandering around, going from place to place with their tourism map and taking their selfies on the shame steps, etc. This is a very, very different city than I encountered when I was there in 2000, where the sort of defining factors in those days were the Yugoslav, the war of Yugoslav separation, right, which has a direct connection to immigration here in Malmo. But today, Dubrovnik, it's all about Game of Thrones. Right? Again, another one of these quotes from a recent article in Vogue magazine about the golden age of television, sort of reprising Dresdner there, and how it's changing tourism. Right? And this is a picture of Monterey, California, which is the setting for the HBO series Big Little Lies. It says here, yet with $10 million episodes and international streaming platforms, TV's tourism influence is now rivaling that of film, perhaps even surpassing it. A report from the University of North Texas found that TV viewing behavior is the strongest predictor of entertainment-motivated tourism. Television series are often watched on a regular basis. Thus, viewers are more likely to be exposed to the destination image for a longer period. So film often was the medium for really going into landscape representation in the past, but television, and particularly since 2000, television series have become more and more attentive to representations, long-form representations of place and space. Technology has also gotten cheaper and more effective in really capturing these vistas that can then be portrayed in the series. And if you think of a television series now, the long form, you're talking about basically equivalent of a 6 or an 8-hour movie. So there's really more time to investigate place and space, and this in turn is actually translating for many series into tourism revenue. People want to come and see those places and usually take a selfie of them in those areas, right? So we see here a tourist map of Malmo. So this is Malmo represented through the eyes of the bridge. And on this visit to Malmo, I've talked to people who say when tourists come over from Copenhagen, one of the first things that the tour bus does is it pulls over to a vantage point where they can turn back and get a good picture with the bridge in the background, which is not as easy to get from the Danish side. So Sweden has that really going for it. But we see here some of the things that are that you should definitely see when you visit Malmo, but we also have some of the things that you would want to visit if you're really interested in the bridge. So I took this picture, right, the other day. I did a little bit of my own tourism of the bridge. It's not as snowy as it was in that representation that I showed you earlier, but definitely we have the gray and the sepia there. This was where Saga's apartment was supposed to be. But this tourism, this inbound television tourism gives a city to basically tell a story that it wants to tell about itself. Once you get someone paying attention to you, it makes it very easy for you to actually tell them the quote-unquote truth, or the version of the truth that you want them to hear. And this was the focus, I mentioned in my research on Sacha Baron Cohen, Borat, and Kazakhstan. This was something that Kazakhstan did as a state, basically as a country. They had this comedian out there making fun of them, basically using Kazakhstan as a prop for their humor. But at the end of the day, Kazakhstan used that sort of global interest in the country to turn itself into something that it wanted to be seen as. And Malmö really was able to do that as well with this heightened interest associated with the city that came from the series. Right, so the last piece of the talk that I want to talk about is this museum exposition, which took place from 2015 into 2016, about what ultimately came to be framed as a non-existent Malmö, which was a title of a article about the city that came out in 2013. So in this, if you had the opportunity to visit the exhibition, you would see this sort of kind of triangulation of the mediated place, that is how something is shown in popular culture, the actual thing, the physical place, and then something that is imagined, right? So that you're basically feeding your own experiences, your own background into. And it is at the center of this triangulation that we basically get what Anna Maratwada and Kim Toft Hansen have referred to as the semiosis of local color, which is extremely important for series such as the Nordic noir series, which really want to present a form of authenticity in terms of representation. So it's key to film things, film the series in places where they're supposedly taking place. Right? And this goes back to the type of research that I've been talking about, wherein you create this sort of life flow, life world as a flow. You have your political opinions, your value belief systems, your attitudes and actions, and these shape how you have civic agency or whether or not you have civic agency, and also they contribute to your concept of cultural citizenship. So you have this on one level. You have audience engagement with television fiction, the construction of reality through world-building processes. And these two circle around. And so it creates a sort of taken-for-granted background of people's everyday lives with the dominant themes evolving across time and place. So all of this begins to work together. So when we're looking at a space, we're putting ourselves in it, right? And there's a lot of other baggage, really, that goes along with that, positive and negative. So these are sort of two pictures that I took from the exhibition. This was the exterior of the museum, and this was what you see when you enter in. So Malmö as this non-existent place. When you enter, it's very dark. You have mood music that is reflective of the type of series that the bridge is. And you also have filming locations showing you all around the city where various murders, various investigations, where things took place, with little clips streaming there down below that show you exactly what is going on. Right? And it really is, the series is about darkness, assaults, substance abuse, and subcultures that live side by side with luxury and excess, all in a kind of shared decay. And so the museum exhibition also had the lookbook on display, which talked about what the show's creators really envisioned for the show, what type of influences that they had in their mind, but also the story that they wanted to tell about the crumbling of the Scandinavian welfare state and the sort of flaws and disorder that exists there. With that, I'll shift very briefly to talking about some of my other projects that I'm working on around the region, specifically one, which is a bit different from Malmö. It's a series known as BORDERTOWN internationally, and in Finland it's SORJONEN. It aired on the main broadcaster beginning in 2016. This is a series that's also available via Netflix and other streaming platforms with English subtitles, also subtitles in other languages. And it's set in the small resort village of Lampenranta, which is the closest city in Finland to St. Petersburg, Russia. It's on that Russian frontier. And like the bridge, it partners two international detectives. In this case, the Finn is a male and the female is an FSB agent, and they solve trans-border crimes. But the series itself highlights a lot of issues with this troubled Russian-Finnish border. Really, it's an example of the complications that exist, this huge, what has been called a system divergence that exists between Finland as part of the European Union today, a country that's well integrated into the rest of Europe, and on the other side, its former imperial master, that is the Russian Federation, a country that has often been, since 2014, has been shunned by much of Europe. The show highlights Lappeenranta as a small town battling big problems. It's in between status and being at the edge of the European Union, but it's also a pristine oasis far away from the polluting effects of both the Finnish capital of Helsinki and St. Petersburg. So it is meant to be this really place that is quite close to nature, and it is the gateway, if any of you are familiar with Lake Saimaa, it's the gateway to Lake Saimaa, a large I think it's the fourth largest lake in Europe. So this is quite a very nice tourist destination. But in this place, you have these traces of evil that are germinated by a sort of suffocating near perfection of Nordic Europe. And this series is filmed in the midnight sun, right? It's filmed during summertime in both seasons. And so, unlike the bridge, you have a completely different color palette with lots of green, lots of sunny skies. You have the blue, the bright blue of the water. But at the same time, these sort of dark crimes are happening. And I'll just give you a few quick views of the city itself. Not very large. It's really defined by the paper mill at the edge of town, which is often depicted in many of the scenes. Right. You can see here. Down below is the harbor. You can actually hop on a boat there and make your way to Viborg, which is on the other side of the Russian border, which used to be part of Finland until the annexation during in the context of World War II. There's another view from the ground level of the harbor, and then you see here again the paper mill from, again, you guessed it, a bridge. And lastly, a depiction here of the Russian-Finnish border. In this case, the reason why I wanted to show you some of these photos is to show that there's kind of a different way to treat the city as a space, but a lot of the hallmarks that we saw, that we see with the bridge and its relationship to Malmö, those actually have worked in other places around Scandinavia and Nordic Europe. I was actually the first Anglophone, the first English-speaking person to take the quote-unquote BORDERTOWN tour. Hitherto, it had only been offered in Russian and in Finnish. And so they thought it was very strange that somebody was coming all the way up to Lappeenranta to do a tour about the show. But what that meant was I got kind of extra special access. And so I've been doing a bit of work on how this series, how we can look at ways in which aspects of the city can be used for, aspects of these Nordic Noir series can be used for tourism, enhancing the reputation of even smaller, quite small places like Lappeenranta. So with that, I think I'll wrap up and I'll let Annette ask me a few questions and we'll see where it goes from there. Thanks.
What a wonderful talk that you've given us. What a rich range of material. And I loved how you went from the very specific, with you situated here and coming over to the bridge and learning about Malmö and the drama, and then taking it out to that much broader sweep of the geopolitical television and the mapping of that and the significance of it. So thank you very much indeed. I wanted to start with a question about the cognitive dissonance that you described in your first encounter with the city, and then this kind of this drama, the bridge, and that cognitive dissonance between this kind of lightness and darkness, or warmth or coolness. This was something that we discovered when we talked to the producers of the drama, and we ended up talking about the cool heart of Nordic Noir. So my question for you is, what is the cool and where is the heart for you in this genre?
Yeah, so I'll sort of pivot back to Bordertown a little
Yeah.
bit because when I arrived in Lampenland, there was no cognitive dissonance. I mean, the city is as it's filmed. I mean, obviously the murders take place there. They're grotesque and often borderline ridiculous, which is, I think, something that really attracts people from outside Scandinavia and Nordic Europe to the criminality that's depicted in the series, because they know it's mostly not going on here, though, you know, occasionally there is the odd crime, such as the submariner who we all know, sort of from Copenhagen, who dismembered someone on board, is something that you couldn't even written into one of these series. I think you would have been laughed away. So Bordertown really is as it presents, but I think a lot of that has to do with the filming techniques that are, and the time of year, and basically the choices of the cultural producers to represent a sunny place with dark crimes beneath the surface. From its very origins, though, the bridge was meant to be the embodiment of that dark story, right? In the way that it's filmed, everything happens within the darkness. It happens in those cracks because those cracks are metaphorical. So where does the heart come in? The series itself, I mean, people can connect with those characters in very different ways. I've been rewatching the first series and found new ways to connect with Martin that really didn't work the last time that I watched. There is a heart to it really is in many ways a family drama on one level, and one of the strangest sort of buddy films, right? In another way, with this strange pairing of two people. So I think it's in the characters where that mapping takes place, but at the same time you can't ignore the environment that they're in. So the contrast between often that warmth or that really personal struggle, and then the anonymizing space in which this representation of the Southern Scandinavia as the showrunners wanted to create. I think that really there's a kind of friction there that makes for good drama and makes for good viewing, and particularly for those of us from outside the region, right? It's an entree into certain aspects of Nordic culture that right now are quite in vogue. I mean, the whole notion of hygge is just selling like hotcakes everywhere. I mean, Americans can't buy enough books about hygge. It's impossible now.
Exactly. Lars Blomgren, who was the executive producer of Braun and one of the key people at Filmlands, he described it as a family drama on steroids. What do you think to that?
A family drama on steroids. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the first series is really all about family, and what you'll do, the lengths that you'll go to protect them. And then I think it evolves into new forms of family, like choices that are made over time. When one creates a family, you're not just born into it, but you decide to make it. And I think in many ways it kind of reflects something that we all grapple with, whether we're in Brazil or whether we're in Australia. We all understand family, we understand friends, we understand bending and even breaking the law to protect the people that we love. And this is sort of, I think, over the sort of meta arc of the series, that question, there's value judgments about when is it time to break the rules. And it starts off very simply, it's only the Danes break rules, right? But then over time we find out Swedes can break rules too.
Exactly. Now, a little cheeky, but do we see a geopolitics on steroids right now?
Yes, I mean, in my opinion, geopolitical thinking, codes, values are starting to infiltrate everything. You can't turn on TV, you can't log into social media, you can't do anything anymore without sort of very large questions on a global scale affecting us. And there really is, I think, there's also sort of the elephant in the room that that increasingly Nordic noir is dealing with, and these are truly global politics. That is the politics of the earth, that is the politics of the Anthropocene, global climate change, the unpredictability of weather moving forward. And increasingly we're starting to see in Nordic noir an attention to this. I would say Occupied is really at the beginning of that, right? Because for those of you that have watched the series, Norway makes a decision to abandon all oil and natural gas production. It's not going to happen, but that's the premise, right? Because of the unpredictability of weather. But increasingly, I think there's a new series that's coming out, which is going to be focusing on Greenland, right? Which is a major area of geopolitical contention moving forward. As some of you may know, Donald Trump tried to buy it a few months ago, right? From Denmark.
Not for sale.
It's we
Not
found
for
out it's
sale.
not for sale. Yeah, yeah. So yes, I think we really are in a sort of special geopolitical moment, and it's not surprising. I would say, looking at it sort of from a 30,000-foot level, the United States, in many ways, is a kind of abandoning its leadership position, and that has created a lot of space for other actors to begin to play. And there's also a lot of insecurity. I mean, a lot of Nordic noir series, they really thrive on that notion of insecurity. And as the U.S. backs away from NATO, countries like Norway and Denmark, who felt protected for a long period of time and made a lot of sacrifices to be part of that union, now feel kind of left out in the cold. And so I think, it is something that can continue to feed in to these series, even if they do take a much more sort of localized focus in their narratives.
So just to pick your brains about the American-Mexican adaptation of The Bridge, again playing with this theme around family drama on steroids, geopolitics on steroids, how did you feel they turned the narrative in a different direction to that particular location?
Well, originally when they were going to adapt the series, it was going to be on the U.S.-Canadian border, which would have given us a similar color palette to what The Bridge is. Lots of grays and blues and boreal forests. And also culturally speaking, there would have been much more similarity between, even if it was a French-speaking Quebecois detective, there is that kind of cultural mesh between the what would be the American on one side and the Canadian on the other. But for whatever factors that went into it, the decision was made instead to place it on the southern border. With that, a complete change in the way that the show was filmed, but also it required a different sort of political engagement. Though the distance to cross from Malmö to Copenhagen and back is much farther than the distance to cross between Juarez and El Paso, the amount of time it takes in the United States to go one way, or definitely to come from Mexico to the United States, is order of magnitude sometimes much larger than that, longer and much more complicated and difficult. And so you have to deal with those geopolitical realities, and that's why I find the Bridge as a metatext is a really interesting geopolitical tool, right? Because it can be moved from place to space. But in terms of the notion of family on steroids, I mean, personally, I didn't like the American adaptation, but perhaps, and a lot of other Americans didn't like it either. It didn't fare very well because it was a little bit too close to home, and some of the elements of the original Bridge that were transported into the narrative of the American one, I don't think gelled that well. So on the personal side, it fell flat, and then on the geopolitical side, maybe those questions were a little too tough to face. Right? It's easier to watch some of this content if it's in a place that's far, far away. Right? It's not you. It's not impacting you. The third adaptation, I found the French British version to be quite intriguing, and it delved into, it sort of pre-mediated the Brexit vote. It focuses a lot on the worries, the insecurities that are felt about that were felt about the issue of migration in Britain leading up to that, and it focuses on yellow journalism and how the media manipulates the threat of unwanted migrants into the country. And I think it bears viewing again now in the wake of Brexit to actually look and see how that adaptation coming out of a Scandinavian sort of origin source was then transported to Britain and dealt with some really timely issues of the day.
Exactly. I mean, it's interesting because I think the British-French adaptation was very strong and went in its own direction to deal with the particular politics, as you say, and sort of regional issues. And yet its distribution platform was a subscription service in the UK. So it was never going to be much talked about in Britain itself. I mean, it did a little bit better in France. So it's interesting around the kind of the different distribution spaces within your work, how much they make an impact on how these geopolitical television series resonate with their kind of with their audiences, those that aren't on the Netflix sort of bandwagon.
Right, and you never know when Netflix is going to get it, right? So the bridge is gained a sort of second life now that it's been added to the platform of Netflix. So when I was wandering around the other day, I saw, still people with their maps wandering from spot to spot, So as these series are picked up by other providers, they have sort of afterlives, right? But yeah, one of the things I do some work on is a sort of the geopolitics of television platforms, right? It's like who gets to watch when in what languages. And those of you that have Netflix and travel with it, you know that as you move, there's different options, right? And also the languages that you can watch a particular series in, those change. So it matters where you subscribe and it matters where you are. So I think this is increasingly, something that we should be paying attention to. It's like as we move around the globe, those of us that have the opportunity to do so, what we see, when we see it, those questions come into play as well. And Netflix is, one of the big, like Amazon, one of the big companies that makes decisions for a lot of us that we don't even know. Yeah,
has a lot of rhetoric that it's reaching big audiences, but we none of us know because it's got a black box in terms of its actual subscription base. So we're curious to see whether it talks a big talk, Netflix, but we're a little suspicious that it is as global and dominating as it is. I've got one more question for you, and then I'm going to start to look around and see if there's some questions for Robert from the audience. I'm sure you've got many really interesting ones to pose to him. So I'll let you warm up a little while I ask you something. Still around, I think, clearly the book is coming out. It's out now? No, it'll be out probably later in 2020. Okay, but it's merged from your head onto paper, and we see the work you did today really building up to this broader argument around geopolitical television. It's really interesting. And I wanted to ask you, what kinds of experiences do you think it can afford, or transnational audiences? You mentioned other work up there around synthetic experiences, which I would question myself, in terms of the sort of the label of synthetic. So I was wondering what kinds of ways you would see those experiences being shaped through the drama into people's lived realities. Memorable ones, moving ones, synthetic, problematic, political. Tell us a little bit more about how you see the power of these dramas.
Well, to take the bridge specifically, I really saw the power of premediation. The fact that many cases popular culture senses what's coming in terms of the real world, what's actually going to happen. Sometimes cultural producers get more credit than they deserve. UNESCO, I think, is a good example with Occupied, because when the series comes out, it coincides basically with the Velvet Glove invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and so it was received as a series that basically saw what was going to happen, but Nesbo said, no, that's not the case. He said, I was actually grappling with Norway's very complex historical identity in World War II, being invaded not just by the Axis forces, but also by the Soviets. And so that idea had been percolating. But to go back to the bridge, it's interesting to see that when the series begins, you have the freedom of movement across the space, right? Shortly thereafter, with the representation in the first episode, right? Traffic stops because there's something blocking, right? And the body comes apart.
The split body.
The split body, right? Then all of a sudden you have the Syrian crisis, which is about real people that are really dying all across Europe in the Mediterranean, trying to get here, literally, in some cases, trying to get here, and Sweden imposes border controls and stops, right? This is the Scandinavian version. Then you have the American, Mexican version. It's all about blocking this unwanted, again, migration of people across the southern border. Not long after the series premieres, Donald Trump launches his presidential campaign with basically one platform, and is that we are going to build a wall. We're going to stop those rapists and criminals from getting across our southern border. And then the tunnel. Right, again, as I said before, focusing on this sort of bubbling resentment towards that free movement of people through the tunnel from the European continent, the notion of the jungle in Calais and all of these immigrants who want to come and take advantage of us in Britain, and how the press manipulates that. And then after the series premieres, then you have the Brexit vote. So I see those, I mean, it could be coincidental, but I really see popular culture as something that kind of feels a magnetism in the air, and often can get stuff on screen or you know, in a comic book or in a video game before what really happens in the real world occurs. And in some ways that helps us prepare, I mean, you know, for that eventuality. We've already seen it before. Right, so in 9/11 in New York, so many people describe the events as it's like something out of a, you know, Hollywood disaster movie. Right, they use that sort of discourse. They use popular culture as a medium to actually explain what they're experiencing. So I think there's really nothing new about that. Popular culture's been doing that for eons.
So it seems as if you're describing a geopolitical structures of feeling, perhaps.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, ways of seeing, right? And then when something coincides with that, you immediately know how to react. I mean, the sort of flip side is, you know, I do a lot of work with representations of Russia and Russians, and I'll ask my students, I'm like, Russians, just say words, just say whatever comes to your mind. And you get the predictable things like bears, criminals, like, you know, Siberia, snow. And I'm like, do any of you know any Russians? Almost all of them do. I'm like, tell me about Russians. And they come up with completely different things. But there is the real world, right? And if you ask them specifically about the real world, then the mind works in a particular way. But if you don't clarify, you just say, what do you think? The sort of mediatized representations often come to the fore the most, because they are so visual and effective, and ways to navigate a very complex world that we often fall back on them.
Absolutely.
I had the question about actually what you were discussing in the end now, how pop culture can be, and through television, can be such a forming media, and how it can create expectations and understanding that how can it be there if you've never experienced that place, and how it can have geopolitical and social significance. And I want to connect it back to before, when you took 3 examples, like the Breaking Bad, the Berlin, Babylon, and Game of Thrones. So do you think that this significance is different, or does it dissipate when the narrative takes place in a fantasy world? Do you think that this significance is stronger when it is actually a reference point that is actually real?
Oh, it's a great question. Yeah, so I've been at Aarhus University quite recently, and some folks down there are actually working very closely with Game of Thrones tourism specifically. And the thing that they're looking at is, do people who are there doing sort of the screen tourism, do they engage with the real geopolitical events that have gone on in those spaces, or are those kept at a distance? So as I mentioned before, in the case of Dubrovnik, this was a site of Yugoslav shelling, or Serbian and Montenegrin shelling. They've sort of rebranded who the enemy was in the past 20 years. And so this is a place of extreme violence, right? If you look back over its history, and if you watch the series, that also is the sort of culminating site of violence. So I think in those fantastical ways, I think it is a sort of larger leap to connect those things together. The same thing goes for Belfast, right? So a lot of the filming for Game of Thrones has been done in the capital of Northern Ireland, which had its history with the Troubles, with this ethnic violence between the Catholic and the Protestant populations. And again, this could be potentially contextualized within the framework of Game of Thrones, which is about these sort of warring houses and these different conflicts, often over religion. But often because of the neoliberal structure, I would say, of the tourism campaigns and the tour buses and the narratives that are going to be told, those questions are often left to the side, right? So they can be quietly sort of swept under the more fantastical narratives. But just because it's fantastical doesn't mean it doesn't have real world ramifications. So going back to Occupied, there were actually some formal protests on the part of the Russian Federation to the depiction of Russia as a potential aggressor against Norway. So television series and these places that are represented in them can sort of bleed into the real world. So I think it's a mixture of the two. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question exactly as you asked it. If you want to push me a little bit.
Can I don't I don't know if I can push you. You're being an expert, me not. But what I am reading in your everything you've said and in your answer is that maybe fantasy-based narratives, they can become a tool in discussing about these things. But then when you have a concrete reference point, something that is taken from your own reality, that you can relate to, that you can actually visit, that you may have a reference point already to, then this is, it seeps in differently. It can be forming of the geopolitical, I'm not going to use that word, sorry. It can be forming in how you feel about that, or how you, it goes back to that loop that you showed before, right? But I don't see the same loop when it comes to fantasy-based narratives.
Can I step in?
Yes, thank you.
But first, would you like to respond to this question? I'm looking for a few more hands to be raised while we're debating this issue. Quick response to that one, or shall I leap in and add?
You can leap in and add, and I'll formulate my follow-on response.
Certainly when we did the audience research, and this was with a great team of people, one of whom is in Malmö, at Tina Ascanius. She did some amazing audience research. So when we were talking to people who lived in the area and they were watching the series, the fantasy wasn't an issue. It was really people, we found people were really able to sort of engage with the drama in terms of its storytelling and its social imaginary as described in the drama. So they understood that world very well, that genre world, and what it was trying to depict, and then their own reality. And what they would use very knowingly is where the drama might spark certain emotional or political feelings. It might provide a narrative thread from the world of the drama into something that they were particularly interested in. It could be around environmental issues, for example, or around adoption, or around autism, which is another big theme that was talked about. So, and they were threads that could be used, like nice resources that could be used to discuss these broader issues. So I don't think the fantasy was a barrier or an issue, even for those living in this particular area, but more they saw the drama as a resource to talk about these things that matter to them, I would say.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, one of the questions that I've always wanted to know, particularly maybe you know about the first season, is kind of coming into it with the research agenda that I had established. And being an American, being exposed to, however tangentially, to being exposed to Fox News and kind of the right-wing framing of Malmö as a city which exemplifies what has often been referred to as Eurabia, basically a place where there's so much migration from the Middle East that identity has been lost. and also these special reports that Fox News has done about Rosengård and some of the other neighborhoods. In the first series, when there is this very explicit representation of the failed integration process with the notion of riots in the street that are ethnically based, they actually don't do it here, right? It's transported to Nordic, it's transported to Copenhagen, and I was curious, sort of, was this? I don't know if you know, but was this made for political reasons? Is this made for other reasons? Is it too sensitive even? So sometimes it is, I think, better to keep a little bit of distance rather than trying to, in these narratives, be too geographically specific when touching on certain issues that have that high level of sensitivity. Because maybe people react differently. Maybe, it actually triggers a controversy about representation. So.
You mean from the production perspective?
From a production perspective.
I don't know the specifics of it. Yeah. Certainly we interviewed the location people that worked on the drama, and a lot of it was to do with pragmatics and access and which bit of the company, whether it was the Danish company or the Swedish company, would be having those particular episodes. So I suspect it was a more pragmatic access issue, but who knows? We should ask them, most definitely.
You talked about the topic of media tourism, with, on the one hand, mentioning the zombies walking around, taking selfies, but on the other hand, it will probably also add value, not only economic-wise, to the city. So my question for you would be, what would you say does the rise of media tourism make to the city, or what would you consider it as something positive, or is there an ambivalence in this development of media tourism?
Well, when I was doing the original article, I got in touch with Eva Astrup, who is part of NOMA Tourism, and I think she, like some of those who were involved with tourism, Danish tourism, Copenhagen tourism, the notion that you are going to actively participate in a project which brings people to your city to see places where dead bodies were, scattered here and there, and all these brutal crimes took place. It can be a bit off-putting, but I think, and certainly I found this in my research, that if you can get tourists coming in, and that's your job, if you're in the tourism business, if you're in the city branding business, once you've got them, once you've got the audience, there's so many things that you can do with them, right? You can provide them with all sorts of other opportunities, cultural, expose them to cultural events. You can cuisine, all of these things then become an option. So the downside really is coming from very, very small places that are being depicted in television series, places that there's just no way they can handle, there's no infrastructure to handle these sort of roving bands of tourists. So Dubrovnik is kind of an in-between space. I mean, it is a city, but it's a walled city, and there's only so many people that can fit inside the walls on any given day. And that is creating resentment amongst the local population. But some other series, such as the ones filmed in small villages in the UK, are just being swarmed, and there's no way to deal with it. And so I think, environmentally, there's also issues. There's increasing. I've been doing some work on tourism in Iceland, and it's a very fragile biome there. And so the more tourists that come, and Iceland per capita has the most incoming tourists vis-a-vis the number of population, with the exception of only one other country, and that is Croatia, right? So we really see the impact of, right now at least, Game of Thrones tourism. But there can be a very strong downside for those areas which really need protection. The environment needs protection, and busloads of tourists trampling all over the place, taking selfies is a bad idea.
Very good question. And that links us very nicely to one of the other themes you're talking about, which is geopolitical tourism. And you mentioned a quote there from some authors who were discussing that those kind of practices of these geopolitical tourists, seeing a social landscape. Do you want to say a little bit more about that? Is that something that you're exploring in your work?
Well, yeah, I mean, sort of the construct of of a space that needs to be preserved is what I'm exploring in my work. So the piece I kind of made vague reference to is actually one of those authors is compiling a volume on the geopolitics of tourism. And I focus on Iceland and the connection, the strategic connection between the UK and the US and Iceland that stems to World War II. But I begin the chapter basically talking about a certain level of security that tourism can provide. So in the planning process that the United States military went through to decide which cities to drop the atomic bomb on at the end of World War II in Japan, Kyoto was one of those on a very short list. And one of the military commanders says, under no circumstances will a bomb be dropped on Kyoto. I went there on honeymoon with my wife, and she would never forgive me. Right? So this simple fact that someone went to visit a particular place at a particular time saved it from nuclear annihilation. So I mean, this matters. And so with Iceland, the notion of Iceland as a place to be preserved, right, whether it's from sort of Russian geopolitical intrigues or Chinese investment or any other sorts of sort of intrusions from abroad, if you have that very strong feeling about a particular place, even if you haven't been there. So we've all, I mean, in the United States, everybody's seen Iceland, right? It's in the Star Wars films, it's in the Aliens films, it's in Game of Thrones. We're constantly being bombarded with images of Iceland, Walter Mitty. So there's all these connections to it. So even if we, as Americans, haven't been there, we know it as a space. But it has skyrocketed in terms of a tourist destination, particularly, ironically, after the volcano, right? Because Iceland interrupted the flows of travel from the U.S. to Europe and back. All of a sudden people wanted to see this place of this kind of biblical sort of creation in the making type of environment.
And thanks for that talk. I'm also American. And I was wondering if you mentioned your students, and it seems like, I mean, the connections between geopolitics and sort of this, the weirdness of how some of the media kind of predicts what happens with politics is interesting. But I also wondered about using this pedagogically, and if you could talk more about how you approach lessons using these texts with your students, and whether, especially because you're not, I was just looking up Farmingdale on my phone.
At least somebody is.
Yeah, right. And it's not so far from a city that has a lot of bridges and a lot of, and it has a lot of different sort of neighborhood identities. So I wondered if you use this idea of the bridge as a lens or a metaphor for students to understand sort of American national kind of geopolitics and these sorts of borderings as well.
Yeah, great question. I actually have used the first season of The Bridge as a teaching tool. And in the most interesting way, I partnered with this sort of online collaboration with RMIT, which is a university in Australia. And so my friend over there, he had his students look at the first series, the Scandinavian version, and apply their sort of cultural lenses as Australians to it. And my students, being Long Island, rather insular, literally and figuratively. I mean, they're really islanders. They're afraid to go to that city that you were referencing with all those bridges. It's a scary place, right? So they both applied their different sort of national frameworks to watching Danes and Swedes, right? And then they engaged online with their comparisons. So you have two parts of the Anglophone world that are, when you compare them next to one another, quite different, and also the level of the students, sort of the backgrounds of the students were a bit different as well. So they were negotiating those issues and then finding points of commonality as sort of Anglophone, people looking at this strange Scandinavian space here. But then there were often points of divergence. And they didn't focus that much on the built landscapes as much as they did on the interpersonal relationships that exist in a very, very different way here. I mean, the most, I have to say, I don't want to even use the word, but I was really taken aback, almost horrified at a moment that I saw in The Bridge, and you'll never guess what it was. There's some point, I think there's a young man in the police station, and he grabs a gun in the police station and starts waving it around, and the police don't really react, and they try and talk him down. And to me, years and years and years of viewing of American crime drama, that scenario was unbelievable. right? Because violence always isn't the first thing that you always do, right? You don't try and take him down, you try and talk him down. And so there are those, I think, really those strong disconnections between everyday American culture that is mediated through our television series and everyday sort of Scandinavian culture that, at least from the perspective of an outsider, is represented in some ways in The Bridge.
I have one for you, Robert. Are you looking at geopolitical comedy?
Good question. Yeah, given that I did all this work on Borat, I have a little bit of background in satire. I have been working on an article with Hannah Boone, who's at Aarhus University.
Yeah.
You know her?
Yeah.
On Untitled, who is a Danish satirist, and he has a sort of the Daily Show type of series that's in Denmark. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with it, but it made an international controversy with Sweden because he has done a spoof of The Bridge, where he has exaggerated the existing stereotypes that are represented and taken them to ridiculous extremes. So the Dane isn't just gregarious and like a Martin Luther, but he's extremely misogynistic, extremely racist, right? And you have his Swedish counterpart being even more of a sort of, as he refers to it, as a PC totalitarian. And so what he did was basically take this spoof of The Bridge and airs it on his show, and it starts to create controversy on this side of the Straits. He then gets invited to, I think it's called Opinion Live. He appears, and he has a group of basically interrogators who are saying that his comedy is very, very inappropriate. And so he then turns that into a campaign, what he calls a humoristic Marshall Plan for Sweden. He wants to free the Swedes from their greatest enemy, that is themselves, who have imposed this PC culture on themselves. And he goes even deeper, saying that Sweden has inadvertently adopted Sharia law without even noticing, and he uses the Plato's cave metaphor. But at the same time, when I first viewed it, I was like, how can this, this is really sort of incendiary comedy. But then on rewatching, I saw that what he uses that opportunity for is to talk about the problems of Denmark, the political problems of Denmark. So through using this satire, he begins to criticize policies that have been enacted on immigration, basically all sorts of other things. So this is a piece that's directly related to The Bridge that I am working on, a sort of geopolitical comedy. But comedy is it's a different beast altogether. It doesn't often travel very far, but in this case, kind of this dispute between neighbors, right, close neighbors, did make its way outside of Scandinavian space, because people started very quickly putting English language subtitles on this controversy, and then it spreads around the internet. So just so you know, what happens here doesn't always stay here.
And some people in the audience will know I'm going to say this, but we're going to recommend another comedy for you to work on as part of your geopolitical mapping, which is Derry Girls.
Oh, yes. So since I saw you in Aalborg, I got two recommendations to watch Derry Girls, and I've watched now both series. So I watched the first one, binged it, and then the second one has since come out. But it would be perfect for your analysis. It is, yes. And I was actually in the Republic when Clinton went there, which was the spoiler, the end of season 2. Yeah. And what's so very interesting is that there's a mural of the actors in the comedy now in Londonderry, which is sort of so interesting. So again, you get that mix of the imaginary world and the real world mixing together. All right. Thank you.